This flip video will introduce you to the Anglo Saxons. Focus topics for information discussed will be found on each slide. Anglo-Saxon was a term historically used to describe any member of the Germanic peoples who, from the 5th century to the 11th century, inhabited and ruled territories that are today part of England and the British Isles. The Anglo-Saxons were the descendants of three Germanic groups: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Those peoples originally migrated from northern Germany to the island of Britain in the 5th century at the invitation of Vortigern, a ruler of Britons, to help defend his kingdom against marauding invasions by the Picts and the Scots. England looked very different 1600 years ago when the Anglo-Saxons came to its shores. Much of the country was covered in thick oak forests. Most of England's 1 million people lived in the countryside, where they made a living from farming. There were many kings, each one ruling over a different area of England. The Romans had invaded England and ruled over England for over 400 years. In 410, the Romans left England because their homes in Italy were being attacked by fierce tribes, and every soldier was needed at home. The people of England were sad when the Romans left, because they had no professional soldiers of their own to protect them from the sea raiders, who were growing bolder in their attacks upon the coast. This is the time in history when the Saxons and Vikings came to Britain. With the breakdown of Rome's control of Britain, it became possible for the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes from across the North Sea, who had been raiding the coast of Britain for hundreds of years, to increase their pressure. Instead of raiding and then withdrawing, by about 450 AD, they were beginning to settle here. The invasion consisted of a series of attacks on different parts of the country over a period of years and under a number of leaders. The Angle, Saxon, and Jute are known as the Anglo-Saxons. The Angles and the Saxon tribes were the largest of the three attacking tribes, and so we often know them as the Anglo-Saxons. They shared the same language, but were each ruled by different strong warriors. The Anglo-Saxons were warrior farmers and came from northwestern Europe. They began to invade Britain when the Romans were still in control. The Anglo-Saxons were tall, fair-haired men armed with swords and spears and round shields. They loved fighting, and they were very fierce. Their skills included hunting, farming, textile making, and leatherworking. We know about the Anglo-Saxons because of the things we have found, giving us quite detailed information about their lives. The Anglo-Saxons were often buried with their possessions. The objects we have found in graves have provided us with evidence of the different jobs done by men and women and the skills they had. Knives and spears were often found in Anglo-Saxon men's graves. This suggests they were involved in hunting, fighting, and farming. Women's graves often included tools used for sewing and weaving, which suggests they were involved in making cloth. The Anglo-Saxons enjoyed horse racing, hunting, feasting, and music making. They played dice and board games such as draughts and chess. Entertainment during feasts included listening to a harp being played and juggling balls and knives. Children played with balls, hoops, and whipping tops, also known as spinning tops. They also played with carved wooden toys such as horses and small wooden boats. The Anglo-Saxons loved eating and drinking and would often have feasts in the hall. The food was cooked over the fire in the middle of the house. Meat was roasted and eaten with bread. They drank ale and mead, a kind of beer made sweet with honey, from great goblets and drinking horns. After the feast, a minstrel would play a harp and sing songs of battles and heroes. The Anglo-Saxons ate what they grew, and they grew cereals, such as wheat and rye for bread, barley for brewing, and oats for animal food and porridge. They grew vegetables, carrots, parsnip, cabbage, peas, beans, and onions, and fruits such as apples, cherries, and plums. Exotic foods such as potatoes, Tomatoes, bananas, pineapples, fruits and vegetables of the New World were unknown to the Anglo Saxons. Barley was used to make weak beer, which was drunk instead of water. River water was often polluted. Wine was imported from the Mediterranean, but only drunk by the very rich. Most Anglo-Saxons were vegetarians because they could not get meat very often. Wild animals such as deer and wild boar were common, but could only be killed by the people who owned the land. And only a few Anglo-Saxons were wealthy enough to pay for a slaughter of an animal. Therefore, pigs were often for food because they could produce large litters which would quickly mature and be ready for slaughter. They were the only animals reared for just their meat. Every other kind of animal served other purposes and were only killed when they became old or ill. Sheep were reared for their wool and meat. Cows were used for their milk, and when they were old, for hides, meat, and glue. All animal fat was valuable for making oils for lamps. At times, the Anglo-Saxons ate fish, which they caught in the rivers and the seas. The first Anglo-Saxons raided the shores of South and East England in the 4th century, but they were beaten back by the Romans. At the beginning of the 5th century, the Romans left Britain. They had not trained the British to defend themselves, and so the next time the Saxons tried to invade Britain, they succeeded. It was during the second half of the 5th century that more and more Anglo-Saxons arrived to take land for themselves. It is for this reason that the time of the Anglo-Saxons is usually thought of as beginning about 450 AD. The Anglo-Saxons left their homelands in northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, and rowed across the North Sea in wooden boats to Britain. They sailed across the North Sea in their longships, which had one sail and many oars. They made a series of attacks on different parts of the country over a period of years and under a number of leaders. The Jutes mainly settled in Kent. They did not call themselves the Jutes. They referred to themselves as the Kentings, that is, men living in Kent. The Angles settled in East Anglia. The Saxons settled in areas of Essex, Sussex, Middlesex, and Wessex. Historians are not sure why the Anglo-Saxons came to Britain. Some sources say that the Anglo-Saxon warriors were invited to come. They came to the area now known as England to help keep out invaders from Scotland and Ireland. Another reason for coming may have been because their land often flooded and it was difficult to grow crops, so they were looking for new places to settle down and farm. They ruled in England for about 500 years. However, unlike the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons never went home. Many people living in England today have Anglo-Saxon ancestors. The name England even comes from the Saxon word Angleland. The Anglo-Saxons took control of most of Britain, although they never conquered the north. They settled in England in places near rivers or the sea, which could easily be reached by boat. One of the places they settled in was Tonbridge in Kent. Tonbridge was an ideal place to settle as it was on the main track from Hastings to London and has a river. At the time when the Anglo-Saxons came to England, much of the country was covered in forest. Only about a few thousand people lived in the whole country. It was an easy place for newcomers to find a place to start a village and then chop down the surrounding forest to make farmland. Many of the names of English towns and villages come from Saxon words. The Anglo-Saxons divided England into 5 kingdoms, each with its own ruling family. The 5 main Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, Kent, and Anglia. The Anglo-Saxons did not understand the Roman ways and would not live in their towns, so the villas, streets, and baths were soon forgotten. They fell into ruins and became covered with weeds. Roman houses were made of brick or stone and had a tiled roof. They even had glass in their windows and underfloor heating. We know what the Saxon houses may have looked like from excavations of Anglo-Saxon villages. In West Stow, an early Anglo-Saxon village has been carefully reconstructed where it was excavated. Using clues from what was discovered, archaeologists have reconstructed the houses as they may have looked 1,500 years ago. We know that the Saxons built mainly in wood, although some of their stone churches remain. Anglo Saxon houses were huts made of wood with roofs thatched with straw. Much of Britain was covered with forests, so the Anglo Saxons had plenty of wood to use. There was only one room where everybody ate, cooked, slept, and entertained their friends. Their houses were built facing the sun to get as much heat and light as possible. The biggest house in an Anglo-Saxon village was the hall, the chief's house. He lived there with his warriors. The hall was long, wide, and smoky, with fire on a stone in the middle. The smoke from the fire escaped through a hole in the roof. The windows were slits called eye-holes. There was no glass in the windows. On the walls were shields and antlers. The floor was dirt and covered with rushes from the riverbanks. Sometimes oxen were kept at one end of the hall. Anglo-Saxon villages were usually very small. The largest villages had no more than a few hundred people living there. The villages were built near natural resources. The villagers needed food, water, fuel for heating and cooking, and materials for their homes and clothes. The natural resources had to provide the villagers with what they needed to survive. The village also needed to protect itself. All around the village was a high fence to keep the herd safe at night from enemies and the wild animals of the forest, wolves, foxes, and boars. The Anglo-Saxons grew crops, kept pigs, sheep, and cattle. They hunted other animals and fish for food. They made household goods and farm equipment from pottery, wood, and metal. Clothes from cloth they wove themselves. They traded goods such as hunting dogs and slaves for things they couldn't make, like glass, with people from other countries. The Anglo-Saxon name for towns was burh. The word burh still appears in many places in Britain. Peterborough, Scarborough are two examples. Names that tell the tribes. The first Anglo-Saxon villages were often named after the chieftain or the leader of the village. This made it clear which tribe the village belonged to. These places often have the letters ing or folk somewhere in their name, often at the end. The first part of the name was most likely the name of the local chieftain. The people who lived in the village of Hastings were called Hasta's people. Hasta was their chieftain. The people who lived in the village of Reading were Rita's people. Rita was the chief. Later Anglo-Saxon villages were named after a feature in their surroundings rather than the name of the chieftain. Oxford got its name because it was a place where oxen were driven across a ford or a river. The Anglo-Saxons were pagans when they came to Britain, but as time passed they gradually converted to Christianity. Many of the customs we have in England today come from pagan festivals. Pagans worshipped lots of different gods. Each pagan god controlled a particular part of everyday life: the family, growing crops, love, healing, wisdom, metalworking, the weather, war, day and night, and so on. Religion was a means of ensuring success in material things. For example, you might pray to a particular goddess for a successful harvest or a victory in battle. Certain days of the week are named after early Saxon gods. Monendag, Moon's Day, the day of the moon. Tuesday, the day of the Scandinavian sky god Tu. Woden's Day, the day of the god Woden. Denrisdag, Thor's Day, the day of the god Thor. Frigdag, Freya's Day, the day of the goddess Freya, wife of Woden. Saturn's Day, the day of the Roman god Saturn, whose festival Saturnalia, with its exchange of gifts, has been incorporated into our celebration of Christmas. And finally, Sun's Day, the day of the sun. About 1400 years ago, the Pope in Rome sent a missionary to England to persuade the Anglo Saxons to become Christians. The leader of the Christian church was the Pope, who lived in Rome. The Pope sent a monk called Augustine to England. Augustine landed in the south and converted the first King Ethelbert of Kent, and then the people living there. The Pope made Augustine a bishop, and Ethelbert allowed him to build a church in Canterbury. Christianity then spread to other parts of Britain. The Pope gave orders that the pagan temples should be converted into Christian ones, and that pagan celebrations should also be made into Christian ones. Missionaries went to other Saxon kingdoms and persuaded them to become Christian too. Churches, usually built of wood, were built in Saxon villages all over Britain. In the 9th century, 400 years after the Anglo-Saxons invaded England, the country came under attack from Viking raiders from Norway and northern Denmark. Like the Anglo-Saxons, they made their home here. They drove the Saxons out of part of the country and took it for themselves. King Alfred, Saxon king of Wessex, fought them in a great battle, but he could not drive them out and had to let them have part of the country called Danelaw. Parts of England were now ruled by the Vikings, while other parts were ruled by the Saxons. In 1066, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England died at the Battle of Hastings. His name was King Harold. William of Normandy, a province in France, became the new king and replaced all the Anglo-Saxon lords with Norman ones, and so brought Anglo-Saxon times to an end.